Hausu or House isn't some underground movie anymore, if it ever was. It was popular on release back in Japan in 1977, however it didn't make it into the West until 2007 when it was released through the Criterion Collection. Since then it's gone from being some unknown movie to being a cult classic to becoming a movie that most people interested in horror have either watched already or at least heard of, and thankfully so. So many people have seen it now and that makes me really happy. It's one of, if not my favourite movie. And what originally attracted me to it was its poster, the bright, vibrant colours and a good IMDb score, and I was on board. And what I watched wasn't something I was expecting, something I don't really think I've seen anything like since. It's not just some crazy Japanese movie, it's something so much more, and even though it's become so popular in recent years, I don't think people quite understand the nuance, subtlety and metaphors presented within it. So this is a brief history and analysis of Hausu. Nobuhiko Obayashi was born in Onamichi, a city in Hiroshima, Japan, on January 9, 1938. His father was a doctor and served in World War II, and whilst he made it back from World War II physically fine, the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima to end the war in 1945 killed many of Obayashi's friends, family, and devastated the area that he was born, and this would become a theme all throughout his later work. Rejecting his father's wishes to become a doctor, he enrolled in film school and gained success, directing experimental movies and commercials throughout the 60s and 70s. Toho, the Japanese film studio, was sick of losing money as Japanese cinema hit a slump in the 1970s. Usually making kaiju and Akira Kurosawa movies, they wanted to make a more irregular movie, and after the success of his commercials, urged Obayashi to write a script. Obayashi consulted with his daughter Shigumi about what scared her, which is where we get a lot of the nightmare visuals from, which I'll come back to later. After shopping it around Toho, no one wanted to direct it until Toho eventually relented and let Obayashi himself direct it. Japanese cinema worked differently. You would join a studio, say Toho, and were selected to direct certain movies only if you were lucky. You'd be moved about and you could end up in the lighting or camera work department or be a general manager of one of the hotels or something. And thank God that they broke their own rules and let Obayashi direct it, because Hausu is such a personally made movie, full of Obayashi's experiences, grief and nightmares. He had such a unique vision for the movie, not really seen at that time, and I don't think anyone else would have done it justice. The movie's story centers on 7 schoolgirls: Gorgeous, Kung Fu, Fantasy, Professor, Mac, Melody and Sweet. Each named after a typical trope of the time where movies wouldn't bother fleshing out their characters but rather base their entire personality around a specific trait. For instance, Mac eats a lot. Professor reads books and wears glasses, and Kung Fu is, well, yeah, you guessed it. In modern phrases, it's flanderization of the characters. If you're unaware of what that is, it's basically taking a trope of a character and making it their defining personality trait. For instance, Ned Flanders began by being attentive in church, and eventually his main character trait became his fundamental belief in Christianity, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a Flanders moment in the later seasons where his belief isn't a very key point of his appearance in the episode.
My pies are done!
Oh, she missed it.
Now, before I get into a general plot synopsis, here comes a spoiler warning. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and go. Once Gorgeous, or Angel, the protagonist, gets home from school, her father tells her that she has a new stepmother who will be holidaying with them over the summer holidays. Gorgeous doesn't like this, however, as she hasn't moved on from the passing of her mother, and asks her auntie if her and her friends can spend the summer at her distant house so that she can spend some time in the house that her mother was born in. As Angel receives her response, she also meets a stray cat and names it Snowy. Snowy jumps from location to location, seemingly uncontrolled by time and space. Throughout the movie, it's unclear who owns Snowy. He jumps from character to character, but it is clear that there is something special about him. The movie is full of metaphors, and it quickly becomes apparent that Snowy represents the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. As they arrive at the house, they are greeted by a wheelchair-bound old woman by a big beautiful house, grey and covered in cobwebs. As soon as the girls enter the house, both it and the auntie slowly begin to come to life as she devours the girls one by one, getting stronger as she does so. First, Mac dies off screen before her decapitated head attacks Fantasy's butt. The girls all have various paranormal encounters, as the auntie becomes more and more alive and teleports through the fridge before smiling at the camera in one of many fourth wall breaks. Snowy the cat leads Gorgeous upstairs, where she finds old war photos of her auntie's lost partner, before she becomes possessed by her auntie after using her mirror and lipstick, whilst Sweet is attacked by futons and disappears, or gets turned into a doll, probably the latter. Gorgeous, now possessed, tries to call the police but decides to go to the police station for help, leaving the rest trapped in a house that is now getting more and more aggressive. Melody plays the piano to calm them all down, and we get probably the most memorable scene in the movie.
あらまいね
With Melody's death, Angel returns and they realise that she's now being possessed. Professor reads the auntie's diary where she talks about how she won't leave the house until her husband returns from the war, not believing that he's dead, as he promised her that he would return. Gorgeous tells them that her auntie died years ago, but her spirit remains trapped in the house, waiting to eat any women of marriageable age who go there. They realise that it's the painting of Snowy that's the cause of all the trouble, and Kung Fu sacrifices herself to destroy it. At which point the house fills with a lake full of blood as the professor dissolves into it. Melody floats over to Gorgeous where she realises that she has truly been possessed. The stepmother finally makes it to the house where Gorgeous takes her hand and she explodes into an atomic fire. The movie jumps between a dreamlike quality and a surrealistic parody throughout, and I think that this scene explains it better than I ever could. You never really know what's an idea suggested by his daughter, a parody of movies and soaps at the time, or just Obayashi's surrealistic nature. Obayashi used surreal methods to frame the movie, from the green screen, practical effects, multiple exposures and matte paintings all throughout. Often matte paintings were used to create backgrounds that wouldn't be able to be shown naturally or cheaply. For instance, in The Wizard of Oz they used one on their approach into the Emerald City, something that couldn't be created naturally. This shot is probably the most memorable from the movie. It creates a beautiful backdrop of fantasy and wonder. Lots of movies up until around the 1990s used matte paintings in sci-fi and fantasy, before CGI and digital compositing made it easier to show unrealistic backgrounds. And whilst they can of course look amazing done properly, there's something about a matte painting that shows a dreamlike surreal quality about it. Now if we look at this scene from House, the background is far from unrealistic to make. They could have just gone to a bus stop in the country and filmed there. Maybe they used the matte because they didn't want to travel to just get one shot, but the effect it created was a dreamlike environment of nature and beauty. It places the characters immediately in a picturesque vision of the past. Throughout, Obayashi invokes magical realism, utilising Japanese fairy and folk tales rather than realism. It features an evil auntie, haunted house and a Prince Charming, albeit the last one is inverted as Mr. Togo never actually did arrive. Where the auntie lives, trapped away in her own dream and memory of a time when she was happy before her husband left. She doesn't live in the present. She lives in her own head, where she's happy. The girls are now entering the auntie's world, and here is the first time that they've arrived. Vignettes were used too to show all footage of the auntie's wedding and her tragic backstory, yet again invoking nostalgia and how she's been trapped away from the modern world that's moved on without her. Vignettes were often used in black and white movies before sound was able to be used, a time that the auntie remembers. Throughout the vignettes, the girls talk over them as if they're being shown at the same time to the audience, discussing thoughts the audience might also share about the attractiveness of the characters and clothes and the tragedy of what's happened. As the movie went on, the dreamlike effects used slowly began to resemble a nightmare. Obayashi used more multiple exposures, and the matte paintings turned darker and more horrifying. I'll always remember this shot of Angel with the fire burning inside of her as she's possessed. Her face begins to crack and fall off, slowly being engulfed by the flames. This shot is beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Usually fire connotes nightmares and hell, but it's also kind of cozy in a way. When the painting of Snowy is destroyed, it spews out blood and the nightmare is complete. The beautiful atmosphere has become a lake of blood. And this is where the clearly not blood actually works for the movie. The unrealistic thin and reddish blood makes sense. It's a nightmare. Nightmares are never representative of life, things are different. Faces, scale, locations, etc. Practical effects like this one kind of show how many different things were used to create the movie. There's so much more that I don't even have time to talk about. Obayashi used so many filmmaking effects, all with a different purpose, and all connoting different things. From dream to nightmares, hope to despair, and optimism to depression. The real enemy of the movie is Snowy the cat. Snowy is a metaphor for an atomic bomb. When the auntie sends Snowy off with a letter response to Angel, what she assumes is a stray cat jumps around the movie, seemingly not controlled by space or time. She beats the girls to the train, to the house, and spends a lot of the time with the auntie. Generally, at the root cause of all the deaths in some way or another, Snowy represents the memory of the atomic bomb that the auntie is experienced and thus at the heart of the movie. Kung Fu realises that she can't destroy the physical cat, but she can destroy the painting, which is the memory of the cat. Even though they're able to destroy the memory of the bomb, the auntie's bitterness over it lives on. You can destroy a memory over time, but the consequences of that memory, the bitterness, grief, the inability to move on, that lives on. The auntie and Snowy tricked the girls into visiting them, so that she could feed off their youth and optimism. It's a tale of two worlds really, those who lived through the horrors of the war and those who grew up afterwards, full of hope, childlike wonder, optimism, and a more westernized culture, all due to the occupation of Japan. This can be seen when they're entering the house. Angel has to remind her friends to take off their shoes before they enter, etiquette that is common in Japan, but her friends have become more westernized, where removing your shoes indoors is less common. A similar thing can be seen when they discuss where to put their watermelon. After the fridge is broken, they have to put it in a well, which is a natural older form of fridge. It's two generations completely at odds with one another. We see the world through the girl's eye, which in part explains the dreamlike nature of the movie and why Obayashi consulted his young daughter for some of these ideas. When you're young, you don't see the world for how it is, but how you want or think that it is. The auntie doesn't want the world to move on, she wants what was promised to her by her husband. By devouring the girls in their youth, it brings life back to her as she waits. She can't move on because she wants the world to be what was promised to her. Not how the world is, but how it should be. Personal tragedy has this effect. It makes you forget about the wider world and how other people might be also coping with the same or a similar thing. The stepmother was the trigger for the girls to go to the auntie, to revisit the past and family before being able to move on to a new life. The stepmother represents New Japan, pure and optimistic, a saving grace to move on and improve Japan. Covered in flowing clothes, beautiful and pure to save the day. However, the auntie's spirit inside her niece has poisoned her to her own bitterness. Memories and horror live on through family down generations. The aftermath of tragedies affect even those who didn't live through them, but are poisoned by the memories of others. Japan wasn't ready to move on. The optimistic future, the stepmother, was foiled. The atomic bomb deeply affected Japan and Japanese culture as a whole. Godzilla, Akira, Astro Boy, Nausicaa, Grave of the Fireflies, they're all responses to the bomb's effect. And it affected in a very different way than in the West, where most of the media isn't about atomic bombs but the horrors of war itself. Western movies like Saving Private Ryan, Dunkirk, Fury are of course their own country's point of view, picturing the horrors of war, sure, but the immediate effect on the characters during the war, whereas a lot of Japanese media features the aftermath, about the soldiers when they returned home, about the families who lost loved ones and the horror of nuclear war. Much like Hausu, Godzilla was a direct response to nuclear fear, and although over time Godzilla's origins and more serious tone has been watered down, it was a direct response to the worries in Japanese consciousness of nuclear war and power in a changing society. In 1954, 9 years after the war's conclusion, a Japanese tuna boat was contaminated with the nuclear fallout of America's bombs. and though only one died from radiation in the following conditions, it was a stark reminder that nuclear weapons have a long-lasting effect on the sites. It must be pretty harrowing, having seen your friends and family die in the immediate bomb, but also knowing that over time the radiation would seriously affect your health and there's nothing at all that you can do about it. There's always very few winners in war, even the winners of the war itself. Everyone has a personal story, and every country struggles post-war. If you consider just death tolls, somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died in World War II. Now consider not just the deaths, but the family and the friends of those who died, the grief, bitterness, and what-ifism that it creates. The ante represents just one person's grief. The end of the war, the bomb, the defeat, disarmament, empire's dissolution, occupation all happened very quickly and led to two different worlds. One side, who lived during the war, a mostly introverted nation expecting victory, reward and honour, only to lose it, lose loved ones and promises. And then the generation afterwards, growing up in a very different country, more westernised due to the occupation, but optimistic and looking forward to the future. The occupation afterwards tried to remove these ideas of Japanese honour and warfare in order to stop it from happening again, but they created two different worlds with irreparable differences. However, the bitterness of the early generation lives on vicariously through the younger generation, much like how the auntie lives through her niece by the end of the movie. In the end, she becomes just as bitter as her auntie, as some memories just can't die. Obayashi made a very personal movie about his own struggles with loss, grief and the difficulties of moving on. He doesn't portray the auntie as just a bad guy, but also not as sympathetic. In this movie, in a lot of ways, Obayashi puts a bit of himself in most of the characters. There's the dad, the auntie and the stepmother. He wants to move on, like the dad with the stepmother. He's made new friends and family, like the stepmother, but ultimately he can't, like the auntie, and he's worried that his bitterness could live on through his own daughter. Obayashi had a unique way of discussing his struggles with loss, grief and moving on. All countries and every person had personal loss during the war, friends, family, jobs, homes, etc., but even in the grand scheme of things it's tiny, whereas to the individual it's everything. You can't see the bigger picture. You think about your loss and the change to your life. It's only natural. You can think of the movie as a zany, crazy B-movie with weird visuals, colours and outrageous scenes, but behind that is a movie about the bitterness of loss creating a ghost. But honestly, if all you take away from it is a good time, then it's done its job because it absolutely is. It's always been one of my favourite movies ever since I first watched it, even before I truly understood the deep meaning behind the scenery, characters and motivations that came with repeat viewings. But in some ways it makes me a little bit sad thinking that people think of it as just a zany, weird Japanese movie, when it was something that was so personal to Obayashi with so many layers. Nobuhiko Obayashi passed away this year, aged 82 from lung cancer. It is possible that the A-bomb was a contributing cause to his demise, but it's not fair to speculate. He spent the rest of his life making movies, mostly with references and metaphors to post-war Japan, nuclear bombs, and saying that it was his responsibility to make sure that the newer generations understand war and its consequences. It's not just the act of war that leaves its toll on us, but it's the aftermath and our attempts of recovery. That's the only reason I'm living in this world and making movies. I just try hard and honestly to express myself freely without telling lies. That's my movie life.